Alexander the Great was 32 years old when he ran out of enemies. He had destroyed the Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen. He had defeated armies several times the size of his own. He had marched his soldiers across deserts and mountain passes that killed men through cold and thirst alone. And now he was dying. Not on a battlefield, not beneath an enemy's sword, but in a room in Babylon, surrounded by the men who had followed him to the edge of the known world. The strange part wasn't that Alexander was dying. It was that he had already conquered almost everything he had ever wanted. So what happens to a man when the world is no longer big enough for his ambition? To understand how he ended up in that room, you have to go back to a boy who was told, again and again, that he was destined for something enormous. He grew up in Macedon, a kingdom his father Philip II had turned from a rough northern backwater into the most feared military power in Greece. From his father, Alexander learned how armies moved, how sieges were broken, how a kingdom was built through force and discipline. That gave him ambition. But there was a second education happening at the same time, and it mattered just as much. For several years, Alexander studied under Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in Greek history, who introduced him to philosophy, medicine, ethics, and the poetry of Homer. His father taught him how to conquer kingdoms. His teacher taught him how to think. And somehow, Alexander wanted both. That combination would later make him strange among conquerors. He wouldn't just defeat the Persian Empire. He would try to absorb it, to rule it in Persian dress, using Persian officials, in a way that unsettled his own Macedonian officers more than any battlefield ever could. There's a story told by later biographers about a horse no one could tame, a massive animal named Bucephalus, rejected by trainers, seemingly unrideable. The traditional account says a young Alexander noticed something the adults around him had missed. The horse wasn't wild. It was afraid of its own shadow. He turned the animal toward the sun, calmed it, and rode it in front of a stunned crowd. Historians today can't verify every detail of that story the way it's usually told, since it survives only through biographers writing centuries later, like Plutarch. But whether or not it happened exactly this way, it became the first story people told about a boy who believed he could see what everyone else missed. Remember that. Because later, when Alexander makes decisions that look almost insane to everyone around him, that's exactly what he'll be counting on again. Then, without warning, his world changed. In 336 BC, Philip II was murdered at his own daughter's wedding, and Alexander, only 20 years old, was suddenly king. A crown should have meant safety. It meant the opposite. Rival Greek cities smelled weakness in a 20-year-old ruler. Some hoped Macedon would simply collapse without Philip holding it together. If Alexander hesitated even for a season, the kingdom his father had spent decades building could unravel in his hands. So he didn't hesitate. Within months, he crushed rebellions across Greece, made a brutal example of the city of Thebes, and secured his throne through speed rather than patience. Then he turned east, toward an empire so vast it was difficult to even describe. Persia. What Alexander proposed next was, by any reasonable measure, close to insane. He crossed into Asia with an army a fraction of the size of what Persia could field. At the Granicus River in 334 BC, that was the problem in front of him. A smaller force invading a superpower. He won anyway. A year later at Issus, the problem was worse. Darius III, king of Persia, brought overwhelming numbers onto the field, a king ruling territory that stretched from the Aegean to the edge of India. Alexander had less of everything Darius had. Less land, less wealth, fewer men. What he had instead was a willingness to gamble everything on the first move. He drove directly at the Persian center, and Darius, watching his own lines break apart, fled the battlefield. It was the first time a king of kings had run from Alexander. It would not be the last. After Issus, a new problem appeared, and it had nothing to do with armies. Tyre was an island. Alexander couldn't march to it. He couldn't surround it with cavalry. He couldn't storm gates that sat surrounded by open sea. So he did something that sounds almost ridiculous when you say it out loud. He decided to build a road to it, through the ocean. For months, his engineers and soldiers hauled stone and timber into the water, extending a causeway meter by meter toward the island walls, under constant attack from Tyrian ships the entire time. It was slow. It was brutal. By any normal military logic, it was unnecessary, since plenty of commanders would have simply moved on. But Alexander wasn't only fighting for Tyre, he was proving something to his own men and to every city watching from a distance about exactly how far he was willing to go to win. When the causeway finally reached the walls, Tyre fell. The city that could not be reached had been reached anyway. From there, Alexander moved into Egypt, welcomed rather than resisted, and turned back toward Darius for one final confrontation. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, the problem was the largest Persian army yet assembled, and this time there would be no recovery for the Persian king. Darius fled a second time, and shortly afterward was killed by his own officers, men who had already decided their empire was lost. Babylon opened its gates without a fight. Susa fell. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia, fell too, and its palaces burned. The empire that had ruled the known world for 200 years was simply gone. Most versions of this story would end here, with the young king standing victorious over the ashes of Persia. Alexander kept going, east, further east, into territory no Greek army had ever mapped. This is where the story stops being a triumph and becomes something else. Because up to this point, every problem Alexander faced had a solution he could find with an army and enough nerve. In India, for the first time, he met an obstacle a sword couldn't touch: his own men. At the Hyphasis River, deep in what is now Pakistan, his soldiers, many of them nearly a decade into this campaign, exhausted, homesick, refused to go any further. According to the historian Arian, one of the more reliable sources on Alexander's campaigns, the king sulked alone in his tent for days, hoping his army would simply change its mind. It didn't. Alexander had conquered kings. He had conquered cities. He had conquered an empire twice the size of anything before it, but he could not conquer the will of his own men. For the first time in his adult life, the answer he received was simply no. And everything after this point tells a different kind of story. Before Hyphasis, Alexander controlled everything around him. After it, that control begins slipping, piece by piece. Ruling an empire this size turned out to be a harder problem than conquering one. Rebellions broke out behind him almost as fast as he advanced. Tension grew between his Macedonian officers, who felt increasingly pushed aside, and the Persian nobility Alexander was folding into his new administration. The same refusal to stop that had made him extraordinary was now exhausting his army, alienating his commanders, and pushing him further from anything resembling home. One night, at a drinking gathering, an argument with Clitus the Black, a senior commander who had once saved Alexander's life in battle, spiraled out of control, and in a moment of rage, Alexander killed him with his own hands. It's devastating not because Clitus was an enemy, but because he wasn't. He was one of the last people alive who had known Alexander before the conquests, before the legend, back when he was simply Philip's ambitious son. What happened to that boy from Macedon who once tamed a horse everyone else had given up on? Somewhere across these years of relentless expansion, the king had begun disappearing behind the myth being built around him, and even the people closest to him were starting to feel the distance. By 323 BC, Alexander was back in Babylon, and by every account he wasn't finished. He was reportedly planning new campaigns, still restless, still searching for the next horizon. Then he became sick. One day passed, then another. His condition worsened. The armies that once moved entirely at his command were waiting. His generals were waiting. His empire was waiting. But Alexander couldn't move. For the first time, the world was moving without him. Modern researchers have proposed everything from typhoid fever to malaria to the cumulative effects of untreated wounds and years of heavy drinking, and no single explanation has achieved real consensus among historians like Robin Lane Fox, who has written extensively on how little the ancient sources actually agree on here. What every surviving account does agree on is the question his commanders asked as he lay dying, barely able to speak. Who should inherit his empire? Tradition holds that Alexander answered with two words, to the strongest. Whether he truly said this, or whether it was added later by historians trying to explain the chaos that followed, is genuinely debated, so it's worth holding loosely rather than as settled fact. What isn't debated is what happened next. He was 32. Silence. The empire he'd built stretched from Greece to India, larger than anything the ancient world had seen before him. And he left behind the one problem he'd never managed to solve. What happens when the conqueror disappears, and the thing he built was never anything more than an extension of his own will? Within years, his generals tore the empire apart between them, carving it into rival kingdoms that would outlast Alexander by centuries, but never again be unified the way he had, briefly and violently, unified it. His name didn't fade the way his empire did. Julius Caesar reportedly wept in front of a statue of him, frustrated by how little he had achieved by the same age. Military commanders for 2,000 years afterwards studied his campaigns as though they held some secret formula for victory. Historians have spent just as long arguing over who he actually was underneath all of it. A visionary who connected cultures across 3 continents. A military genius without real equal in the ancient world. A ruthless conqueror who burned Persepolis and killed a friend in a drunken rage. Maybe all 3 at once. Because here's the question underneath all the battles and all the cities and all the roads built through open ocean. It was never really a mystery how Alexander conquered so much. It's why conquering the world was never enough to satisfy him. He had spent his entire life searching for another horizon, another kingdom, another battle, another victory. Until finally there was nowhere left to go, and the one enemy he could never outmaneuver had been waiting for him in Babylon the entire time.